Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I've changed a lot as I grew up. By the time I started my freshman year at Pinewood High, I had already moved 11 times and had been at my current location for about a year and a half. It was the early 90s, and grunge was just hitting the mainstream. Flannel shirts, ripped jeans, and Pearl Jam cassettes were the currency of cool. I'd managed to find a tight-knit group of friends at the local arcade, where we'd spend hours after school playing Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. We all ended up at the same high school, which is how I met Julian. He was friends with Mia, one of my arcade buddies. They played together in a garage band, and despite being almost 5 years older than us, we welcomed him into our circle. Julian was easily twice my size, tall and muscular, with long dark hair he kept tied back. At first, he was a bit intimidating, though I've never been afraid of big guys. I guess you learn from experience. My home life was difficult. My mom worked 2 jobs, and my stepdad had a temper that worsened with each empty bottle. I tried to spend as much time away from home as possible, often hanging around the mall food court or the arcade until 7 or 8 at night with my friends. 4 of us lived along the same route home, and we'd walk together for about 45 minutes until our paths diverged. One particularly foggy evening, unusual for our small coastal town, Julian offered to walk me the rest of the way home since everyone else had already headed off. I figured he was just being polite. As we walked, our footsteps echoing on the empty boardwalk, he mentioned his previous move from another state. I didn't walk my friend home that night, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Something terrible happened. He stopped there, the statement hanging in the mist between us, and I let him accompany me home, the wooden planks creaking beneath our feet as we walked in silence. After that night, we became much closer. We bonded over shared experiences of constantly being the new kid, of always feeling like an outsider. We exchanged numbers, and he started texting me late at night about his depression. I genuinely wanted to help him. I knew what it was like to feel alone. A few months later, he tried to ask me out. It was this grand, romantic gesture. He learned a Nirvana song on his bass guitar and played it for me in the courtyard during lunch. But I was already seeing someone, a skater named Ash who worked at the record store. When I turned Julian down, he got very angry. It was a quiet, nervous, even slightly frightening kind of rage. I felt uncomfortable, but I started noticing him everywhere. We were still friends and still hung out in groups, but I'd pass him on the boardwalk while I was heading somewhere, and a few minutes later, I'd notice he had changed direction and was following me. He began escorting me to classes from a distance during passing periods, lurking by water fountains, pretending to be reading class schedules posted on walls. I started cutting down the time we spent together, and he followed me even more. I made my friends meet me outside every class and walk me to the next one, because I began feeling unsafe. He even knew the beach house where I lived, the one with peeling blue paint and wind chimes made of sea glass my mom had collected. Then he started talking not to me, but to our mutual friends about that girl he had tried to walk home. At first, it was just my name, some coincidence. But then he said she had the same auburn curly hair and green eyes. And with each time he talked about her, she became more and more like me. And then he told them what happened. Week by week, this fantasy developed. They were walking home when they passed by a dark pier, and a man with a rusted fishing knife appeared from the shadows and asked for something valuable. She started reaching for her backpack. Julian told my friend Mia, while I hid around the corner, listening. She didn't have anything else, and he thought she was going for a weapon. The story grew darker with each telling. He stabbed her once, twice, and again, Julian said, voice hollow but eyes bright. I stood there frozen. I watched everything turn red, and I grabbed a broken bottle near me and went after him. I killed him with his own knife. He told everyone he had killed someone. My stalker had killed someone. No matter how twisted he was, I no longer cared whether this was fantasy or reality. I didn't care how this would affect his mental health. I wanted to go to the police. I was terrified for my life. My friends convinced me to talk to the school counselor first. That morning we went to her and told her everything. The stalking, the stories, how he confessed to murder, and that this was apparently why they had moved. The counselor, Ms. Reeves, had kind eyes behind thick glasses, but they hardened as we spoke. Since I was scared for my life and wanted to call the police, I thought she would take us seriously. She spoke with the vice principal, Mr. Hargrove, who wasn't a mental health professional, and he called Julian in to discuss the accusations. Then Mr. Hargrove informed me that he didn't believe Julian had any mental disturbances, or that I was in any danger. Teenagers have vivid imaginations, he said, straightening his tie. Julian comes from a good family. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding, and that was it. I lost faith in adults and gave up on going to the police. I continued spending time with friends, being escorted between classes, hiding behind my toxic boyfriend, and looking over my shoulder with every step on my way home. The sound of waves crashing against the shore no longer soothed me. Instead, I heard footsteps in every crash, saw shadows in every bit of sea foam. During that year, the counselors gaslighted us so much that everything seemed like a nightmare. And I would have thought I made it all up if it weren't for my journal entries documenting the events and the growth of my anxiety, as well as similar stories from my group of friends. One day, months later, I noticed Julian wasn't at school. Then another day passed, and another. Someone said his family had moved again, in the middle of the night, leaving their rent unpaid and furniture behind. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt a chill. Where had they gone? And why so suddenly? It wasn't until years later, flipping through an old newspaper archive for a college assignment, that I saw it. A small article about a cold case being reopened. The stabbing of a teenage girl near a pier in Julian's previous town. The timing matched his story perfectly. A small clarification to explain the confusion. I don't think anyone died in the past. I believe he was a pathological liar, so immersed in fantasy that he convinced himself it was reality. No, I wasn't physically hurt, but it was emotionally traumatic, and the threat he posed to me was 100% real. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear the creak of footsteps on a wooden boardwalk, and sometimes just sometimes, I wonder if that newspaper article was real, or if my mind created it to validate what I'd always feared, that monsters don't always look like monsters, and sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that might be true. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Last week, I found myself at a classmate's cabin, working on a group project that was due the following morning. I live in a small apartment complex near our college in Vermont, while my classmate's family owns this remote cabin nestled in the Green Mountains. To get there, you have to drive along this winding mountain road that snakes through dense forest for about 7 miles. No streetlights, hardly any guardrails, and practically no cell service. We started working around 4 in the afternoon, and I ended up staying later than planned as we struggled with the final touches. By the time I left, it was already past midnight, with a heavy fog rolling in from the valley. I hadn't anticipated how treacherous that mountain road would be in these conditions, especially in my old sedan with its worn-out headlights. The fog was so thick I could barely see 15 feet ahead, and the road was littered with fallen branches from a storm that had passed through earlier that day. I drove at a crawl, maybe 20 miles per hour at most, terrified of blowing a tire since I'd used my spare just last month when I hit a pothole outside the college library. I was about 3 miles from the main highway when I rounded a particularly sharp bend, and suddenly had to slam on my brakes. There, blocking almost the entire road, was an old Winnebago RV parked at a bizarre angle. The position was so deliberate, it left maybe 2 feet of clearance on one side, with a steep ravine dropping off on the other. There was no way my car could squeeze past without risking a plunge into the darkness below. My only option was to reverse back around the bend to a small turnout I'd passed earlier, where I could turn around and find another route down the mountain. I put the car in reverse and started to back up slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the RV. Initially, I couldn't see anyone inside the vehicle, but as I shifted to get a better angle, I flicked on my high beams and spotted a figure slumped over the steering wheel. It looked like a woman with long, dark hair, completely motionless, as if she'd passed out or worse. For a split second, I considered stopping to help, but something felt deeply wrong about the whole scenario. The way the RV was positioned seemed too intentional, like a trap. I'd heard stories from my uncle, who works for the state police, about criminals using distress situations to lure good Samaritans, especially in isolated areas. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. I continued backing up, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I glanced in my rearview mirror to navigate, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The previously empty road behind me now had a pickup truck parked on it, its headlights off. I hadn't heard it approach over the sound of my own engine and the rain that had started to fall. Looking back at the RV, I saw the unconscious woman was now sitting upright, staring directly at me. In the same moment, the driver's door of the RV swung open, and 2 men in dark hoodies emerged, moving quickly toward my car. The woman remained seated, but was clearly coordinating with them, speaking into what looked like a walkie-talkie. Pure adrenaline took over. I shifted gears and floored the accelerator, aiming for the narrowest part of the gap by the RV. My car scraped violently against the rocky hillside, shattering my passenger window and tearing off my side mirror. I could hear the awful sound of metal dragging along stone as I forced my way through. As I cleared the RV, one of the men lunged at my car, grabbing onto my broken window frame. For a terrifying few seconds, he was half inside my car, reaching for the steering wheel. I caught a glimpse of his face, gaunt, with strange ritualistic tattoos covering one side, his eyes unnaturally dilated and wild. He smelled of chemicals and dirt. I swerved hard, throwing him off balance. He lost his grip and tumbled away from the car. I didn't stop, didn't even look back until I had reached the highway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Every few seconds, I checked my mirrors, terrified of seeing headlights in pursuit. Somehow I made it back to town and drove straight to the police station, still shaking uncontrollably. The officer at the desk seemed skeptical at first. They often get reports of strange sightings in the mountains that turn out to be nothing. But when they saw the damage to my car and the genuine terror in my eyes, they immediately dispatched 2 patrol cars to the area. I stayed at the station until nearly 3 in the morning, giving my statement. My classmate and his parents arrived to take me back to their cabin for the night. There was no way I was going back to my empty apartment after what happened. The next day, the police called to say they'd found the site, but no RV, no pickup truck, and no suspects matching my description. They did, however, find fresh tire tracks and some blood on the rocks where I'd scraped my car, blood that wasn't mine. They've increased patrols in the area and are checking traffic cameras on the surrounding highways. It's been 5 days now, and I still jump at sudden noises. I've changed my routes to and from campus and started carpooling with friends whenever possible. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, seeing that man's face at my window, those strange markings on his skin, the dead look in his eyes. The police think it might have been part of a trafficking operation that preys on isolated roads in rural areas. They've asked me to keep the details quiet while they investigate, but I needed to share my story somewhere. If you're ever driving alone on a remote road and come across a suspicious situation, please don't stop to help. Call emergency services when you reach a safe area with reception. Trust your instincts. They saved my life that night on the mountain. I always imagined that my first solo property showing would be a significant milestone in my real estate career, a moment that would demonstrate my professional capabilities and boost my confidence. It was supposed to be a straightforward day in the autumn of 2011. A routine task allowing me to showcase a well-maintained property to a potential buyer in a small Connecticut town. But what should have been an ordinary event ended with police cruisers parked outside the house, and an unsettling feeling that would stay with me for years to come. I had joined the industry only 7 months earlier, working for a boutique real estate agency led by a veteran agent who took pleasure in teaching me every nuance of the profession. During those initial months, I shadowed him diligently, carefully observing each client interaction, every valuation strategy, and all aspects of the sales process. When I was finally assigned to conduct a showing on my own, I saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate everything I had learned and prove my value to the team. The property I was scheduled to present was an older Victorian home, 3 stories with 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a layout that perfectly balanced historic charm with modern amenities. Despite its obvious appeal, this house had remained on the market longer than anticipated, perhaps due to its isolated location at the end of a winding road, surrounded by dense maple trees that had begun to shed their fiery leaves. My client, Rebecca, was a novelist looking for a quiet retreat where she could focus on her writing without the distractions of city life. She had expressed significant interest in this property after seeing the online listing, and I wanted to ensure everything was perfectly prepared for her visit. The forecast had predicted heavy rain later that evening, so I arrived 90 minutes early to check that the property was in pristine condition and all lights were functioning properly. The late afternoon brought an unusual fog that crept across the property, wrapping around the trees and obscuring the neighboring homes. As I approached the main entrance, my uneasiness began immediately. The front door was slightly ajar. I paused, feeling a chill run down my spine, despite the unseasonably warm day. The house should have been empty, and I had verified the records that morning, confirming no visits or maintenance were scheduled. I took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open wider. The air inside felt strangely thick, with a subtle scent of old wood and something else, something metallic that I couldn't quite identify. This detail might have seemed insignificant, but it was enough to heighten my sense of apprehension. I entered cautiously, switching on lights and placing my portfolio on the antique sideboard in the entryway. Silence dominated the space, interrupted only by the sound of my footsteps on the creaking hardwood floors and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Everything appeared to be in order. The furniture was positioned according to our staging plan, and the neutral decor was designed to appeal to potential buyers without being too impersonal. But as I began to walk through the house, small details caught my attention. A desk drawer in the study that was partially open, a depression in the cushion of the window seat in the master bedroom, as if someone had recently been sitting there, a cabinet door in the hallway that wasn't fully closed, and strangest of all, a faint warmth emanating from the old cast-iron radiator in the corner, though the heating system should have been off. It could have been oversight from the cleaning crew, or perhaps the property inspector who had visited earlier that week. However, the uneasy feeling continued to grow within me. As I reached the 3rd floor, which contained 2 smaller bedrooms tucked under the eaves, I heard a distinct creak from behind a door at the end of the narrow hallway. My heart rate quickened, and I turned toward the sound. I called out, but received no response. I remained frozen for several seconds, listening intently for any other noise before gathering the courage to investigate. I checked both bedrooms and the small bathroom between them. Everything seemed in order, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different from when I had last visited the property with my mentor. Trying to convince myself there was no reason for concern, I returned to the 1st floor and began arranging brochures on the dining room table, attempting to distract myself from the persistent unease. At that moment, my phone vibrated. Rebecca had arrived 15 minutes early. I felt relief wash over me at the prospect of company, and hurried to greet her, meeting her with a professional smile as fat raindrops began to fall from the darkening sky. She seemed genuinely interested in the house, listening attentively to my explanations about the original architectural features and recent renovations. I noticed she was particularly drawn to the built-in bookshelves in the study and the generous writing desk positioned near the bay window. However, as we climbed to the second floor, her expression suddenly changed. Her gaze fixed on the hallway ahead, and the color drained from her face. I asked if something was wrong, but she didn't respond. She simply raised a trembling hand and pointed. I looked in the indicated direction and felt my heart stand still. A man stood at the far end of the hallway, barefoot, wearing dirty jeans and a tattered flannel shirt. He appeared gaunt and disheveled, his face unnaturally pale in the dim light, with eyes that seemed to look through us rather than at us. The stillness of his posture and the vacant expression on his face were terrifying. Rebecca gripped my arm tightly, whispering that we needed to leave immediately. I agreed, struggling to maintain my composure. We moved slowly toward the stairs, never taking our eyes off the man, every muscle in my body tensed with fear. But just as we reached the top of the staircase, he suddenly grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that revealed blackened teeth. Then he lifted his hand to show a glinting object that I realized with horror was a long, rusted key. "Looking for this?" he asked in a hoarse voice that seemed unused to speaking. "Can't leave without the master key, can you?" Without thinking, I pulled Rebecca down the stairs, nearly stumbling in our haste. We could hear his footsteps behind us, unhurried but deliberate. When we reached the front door, I realized with a jolt of panic that my car keys were in my portfolio, which I had left on the sideboard. But Rebecca, thinking more clearly than I was, pulled me toward the kitchen and out through the back door into the pouring rain. We sprinted across the sodden lawn toward her car, fumbling with the keys as the rain drenched us. Once inside, we locked the doors and immediately called the police. Within minutes, several police cruisers arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the rain and fog as armed officers entered the house. Time stretched endlessly as we waited, filled with anxiety. When one of the officers finally emerged, he brought disturbing news. They hadn't found the man, but they had discovered evidence that someone had been living in the house for some time. In a hidden storage space under the eaves of the third floor, they found neatly folded clothes, several empty food containers, a sleeping bag, and most disturbingly, a notebook containing detailed observations about the comings and goings of real estate agents who had shown the property over the past month. The back door had been left wide open, suggesting he had fled when he noticed the police presence. But what truly chilled me to the bone was the discovery that several small cameras had been hidden throughout the house, including one pointing directly at the sideboard where I had left my portfolio, containing not only my car keys, but also my home address on some of the documents. That night, as the police officer escorted me home and checked my apartment for safety, I realized how differently things could have ended. He had been there before I arrived. He had been watching while I walked through the hallways, organized materials, and waited for Rebecca. What would have happened if she hadn't noticed his presence, or if he had decided to confront us differently? I never conducted a showing alone again after that day. I never ignored a door that was even slightly ajar. and I never dismissed that instinctive feeling of unease that sometimes warns us of danger. Most importantly, I learned that the most frightening aspect of any empty house is the possibility that it might not be empty at all. When the crowds disperse, the lights dim, and silence settles in, museums transform into something entirely different. At night, they seem to be waiting for something, as if the past yearns to break through into the present. I started working as a security guard at the Maritime History Museum in Newport, Rhode Island, during the summer of 2022. The place wasn't as renowned as other major institutions, but it possessed a unique atmosphere that set it apart. Victorian maritime artifacts, weathered ship models, dimly lit corridors lined with portraits of sea captains whose eyes seemed to follow your every move. The core of my job was straightforward: monitor the security cameras, conduct hourly rounds, and ensure no one breached the premises after hours. However, there was one rule that Margaret, the head of security who'd been there for 27 years, emphasized on my first night. Lock all the doors before 11, no exceptions. She said it with such gravity that I almost laughed, thinking it was an exaggeration for a task that essentially involved checking locks and drinking terrible coffee. But from the way she looked at me, from how her weathered hands gripped the keys, I knew she wasn't joking. I asked why she stressed this point so much, and she let out a heavy sigh, running her hand across her forehead as if she'd explained this 1,000 times before. The museum closes at 6, but sometimes certain people remain inside, she said. Not tourists, not staff, but people who shouldn't be here. If you don't lock the doors, you might encounter someone inside who has no right to be here. I figured she meant homeless individuals or perhaps teenagers trying to break in. Either way, I wasn't concerned. I'd worked security before and knew how to handle most situations. I should have paid more attention. I locked all the doors, checked each exhibit, and continued monitoring the security cameras. But after several shifts, I began to feel comfortable. The museum was always empty. So the following Friday, as 11 o'clock approached, I hesitated before locking the final door, the one leading to the old captain's quarters exhibit. I was alone. What could happen if I waited a little? Maybe it was just boredom, or perhaps the desire to prove Margaret wrong. But for the first time, I left one door unlocked, just to see what would happen. At first, nothing happened. Then, around 1:17 in the morning, the motion sensor in the captain's quarters was triggered. I sat up straight, eyes fixed on the monitor. The captain's quarters housed some of the museum's oldest exhibits: antique nautical instruments, Civil War-era weapons, and a large display of mannequins dressed in 19th century seafarer attire. The screen flickered momentarily. I thought I saw something move near the mannequins. Someone was there. I grabbed my flashlight and left the security office. The captain's quarters were at the far end of the museum, and as I walked down the long corridors, the silence around me felt even more oppressive. My footsteps echoed, bouncing off the polished wooden floors. When I reached the exhibit, I slowed my pace. The mannequins stood in their usual positions. 4 figures frozen in time, dressed in captain's coats and weathered hats. However, one of them looked different. I swept my flashlight across the display. The plaque on the mannequins, listed the names of historical seafarers. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, but there were 5 figures. The 5th figure stood slightly behind the others. I was confused. The museum didn't have 5 mannequins in this exhibit. I took a step closer, and as I adjusted my flashlight, it moved. The air caught in my throat, and my body froze. I turned the flashlight directly at it, my heart pounding against my ribs, and the figure vanished. I swept the beam across the entire room. The mannequins stood where they always had, with their painted eyes staring straight ahead. But the 5th figure, the man I was certain I had seen, was gone. I conducted a thorough check of the room, looked behind display cases, listened for footsteps. Nothing, but I knew what I had seen, and the longer I stayed there, the more wrong the environment felt, as if I had disturbed something I shouldn't have. I locked the door and returned to the security office. I reviewed the security camera footage 5 times before calling Margaret. The video showed the mannequins remaining in place. Then at 1:17, something moved in the shadows. A shape stepped forward, just enough to trigger the motion sensor, and then disappeared. It didn't walk away or run, it simply vanished. My hands grew clammy as I held the phone. Margaret answered on the first ring. "Did you leave a door unlocked?" Her voice was eerily calm, as if she had been waiting for this call. I swallowed hard. There was someone there. In the captain's quarters. After a pause, she sighed. "Call the police. Ask them to check inside the walls." The police arrived before dawn. Initially, they were skeptical, even after I showed them the footage. They said it was a technical glitch, but when they searched the captain's quarters, they found something else. A hidden access panel, a portion of the wall that opened up. Inside was a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a collection of clothing. Someone had been living within the walls of the museum. The officers conducted a full sweep of the building, but whoever it was had already left. The only clue remaining was a naval officer's hat, neatly placed on the floor next to an old journal. The journal contained drawings, detailed sketches of the museum's layout, notes about guard schedules, and eerie observations about visitors. The most disturbing entry was dated the previous day. "The new guard breaks pattern. Opportunity awaits." After that night, the museum's security was enhanced. New locks, additional cameras, and motion sensors within the walls themselves. Margaret refused to discuss the incident further, saying only, "Some things are better left undisturbed." I resigned 3 weeks later. I never got answers to my questions. Who was this person? How long had they been there? But there's one thing I can't forget. That night on the camera footage, when the motion sensor was triggered, the figure wasn't just moving. It was watching me, looking directly into the camera. And had I not locked the remaining doors, I think they would still be there. What truly haunts me isn't just the intrusion, but what I found scribbled on the last page of the journal, in handwriting that didn't match the rest. We've been watching this place for generations. Some of us never leave. Sometimes I dream about that museum, the silent corridors, the watchful portraits. And sometimes, in those dreams, I'm not the one doing the watching. I'm the one being watched, just another figure frozen in time, waiting for someone to notice that I don't belong. Our cabin was rustic, but cozy. nestled among the pines in the mountains outside Boulder. To better describe it, our bed was positioned in the center of the main room, pushed against the back wall. We were lying in the most comfortable way possible, with our heads where feet would normally be. The old record player had stopped spinning, but the vinyl was still in place, as if paused mid-song. Nothing was playing, but the warm amber glow of the vintage amplifier remained on, casting soft shadows across the wooden floor. My husband, already exhausted from our day of hiking, rested his arm across my back and quickly drifted off to sleep. I could hear his steady breathing and knew he had reached the deepest stage of sleep. I, on the other hand, was still lost in my thoughts, so I decided to pick up my phone and scroll through social media to distract myself from the unfamiliar sounds of the forest around us. What happened next was completely unexpected. Just as I started to calm down and allowed the unpleasant worries of the night to fade away a little, I heard something. It was a word, or maybe almost an indistinct word. "Hello," I froze. The sound was so soft that at first I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it, or if it was something from my imagination. However, the sensation was unmistakable. It was a word, and it was here, in the silence of the night. I felt time stretching out. The moment became so long that it was almost unbearable. My eyes began to dart frantically. First, I looked at the record player, then at my husband, and finally at my phone screen, which now seemed too bright in the darkness. At this moment, I tried to convince myself that it was just a hallucination caused by fatigue. "I'm much more tired than I thought," I told myself. But then I heard it again, more distinctly now, as if someone had really said hello. This time there was no doubt. I was certain of what I had heard, but the sound wasn't loud. It was quiet, soft, almost as if someone was making sure I was actually awake. I immediately turned my body, tense with fear, and realized something was wrong. When I looked toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, I felt a shock run through me. I saw a figure, a silhouette in the darkness. At that moment, the voice and figure connected, and I realized that this voice wasn't coming from a safe place, but from somewhere nobody should have been. I can't exactly describe that feeling, but in that instant, I knew danger was near. The sense of intrusion was so real that I still clearly remember the anxiety that gripped me. The antique grandfather clock in the corner showed 3 in the morning, and now it was 3:33. Since that incident, I can count on my fingers how many times I've managed to fall asleep before 3 in the morning. And when it happens, I always check to make sure everything is in place and locked up tight. That's why I'm writing now, because once again I can't sleep. The feeling of fear was so great that without any thought, I screamed with all my might. My scream was enough to wake my husband. He quickly rose, confused, not yet understanding what was happening, but immediately shouted too, preparing for whatever might come. He rushed to the bedroom door and flung it open, and there was the intruder. He was standing in the hallway, looking at us in the darkness. The shock was so immense that we didn't know what to do. Even he didn't seem to know what he wanted. Honestly, we still don't know exactly what that man was looking for. But there was something in his gaze that completely threw us off balance. His eyes reflected the moonlight coming through the skylight, giving them an unnatural glow. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, like any normal hiker or local, but something about his presence felt ancient and wrong. My husband, without thinking, pushed the man aside and ordered him to leave, loudly demanding that he get out of our cabin. It was a Thursday night in late autumn, and we were a 40-minute drive from the nearest town, which might seem like a long way, but it's actually a short distance for someone determined to reach a specific destination. We both thought the man had just wandered into the wrong cabin until he said, in a calm and chilling tone, "I'll go," and turned to leave. But he didn't head toward the front door. Instead, he moved toward the sliding glass doors that led to the back deck. He left so quietly, so quickly, that we almost didn't notice. He vanished into the darkness of the surrounding forest, and for a moment we stood there, not knowing what to do. Adrenaline was still pulsing through our veins, and we didn't know whether to call the police or just try to return to normal. We decided to call the police right away. I was in shock, confused, and at that moment I was sure he had simply made a mistake and entered the wrong cabin. Only after we talked more about what had happened and spoke with others did I realize that what occurred wasn't a simple misunderstanding. That man wasn't lost. There was something much more sinister behind his presence here. The police arrived nearly an hour later, sweeping their flashlights through the trees surrounding our cabin. They found footprints in the soft earth, but strangely, they only led to our cabin, not away from it, as if the man had appeared out of nowhere. The officers took our statements and promised to increase patrols in the area, but I could tell from their expressions they didn't expect to find him. 2 days later, when we were preparing to leave, the owner of the cabin came by to check that everything was in order. When we mentioned the intruder, her face went pale. She hesitated before telling us that every few years, someone reports a similar encounter in this part of the mountains. A man who appears in homes at night, always between 3 and 4 in the morning, always leaving through the back door, never taking anything. Local legend says he's searching for something he lost decades ago. Some say he was a miner who died in these mountains during the gold rush. Others that he was a hermit who lived in the wilderness until he vanished during a particularly harsh winter. I don't know what to believe, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by someone who shouldn't have been in my home. Someone whose presence felt both human and not quite right. And each night as the clock approaches 3, I still find myself checking the locks and listening for that soft hello in the darkness. As a flight paramedic working for the Mountain Rescue Service, helping people is second nature to me. I'm trained to run toward trouble, even when it's not the safest option. Most days, I can separate work from my personal life, but there are moments when this instinct to help can lead me into situations I'm not prepared for. That's exactly what happened last autumn in the Colorado Rockies. I was driving back from visiting my sister, who lives in a small mountain town about 3 hours from my cabin. The winding forest road was rarely traveled, especially after sunset, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 45 minutes. The evening was peaceful, the kind where the purr of your engine and the crunch of gravel beneath your tires seemed like the loudest sounds for miles. The autumn air was crisp, and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the road. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, something immediately caught my attention. A vintage red pickup truck was pulled over with its hazard lights blinking weakly. The hood was propped open, and as my headlights illuminated the scene, I noticed a figure sprawled on the ground about 15 feet from the vehicle. They were motionless, lying face down on the dirt shoulder, their form eerily still in my headlights' glow. I've dealt with everything from minor cuts to devastating multi-vehicle pileups. So my first instinct was to stop and check if the person was all right. However, as I began to slow down, a strange feeling washed over me, like something wasn't quite right. For one thing, there were no skid marks on the gravel road, a small but significant detail. If a vehicle had stopped suddenly due to mechanical failure, you'd typically see at least slight evidence of rapid braking. Additionally, despite its age, the truck appeared to be in perfect condition, parked at an almost calculated angle that didn't fully block the road, as if intentionally positioned. I eased off the accelerator, considering my options. Every part of my training told me to stop and help, but something deep inside was urgently signaling that I should just keep driving. The forest around me suddenly seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I decided to stop anyway. I couldn't just leave someone lying there, even if it felt dangerous. I'm a paramedic, and if there was even a slight chance someone needed help, I had to check. I pulled over about 30 yards past the truck, leaving enough distance to maneuver if necessary. I stepped out of my Jeep, but left the engine running, the headlights on, and the driver's door open, just in case I needed to react quickly. I grabbed my emergency flashlight from the glove compartment, its reassuring weight providing little comfort against my growing unease. As I approached, I scanned the surroundings carefully. The air was unnaturally still, with not even a whisper of wind through the pines. All I could hear was the idle of my own vehicle and the crunch of my boots on the gravel. The forest on either side of the road was dense and dark, hiding whatever might be lurking within. When I got closer, the scene became clearer. The person on the ground hadn't moved, lying face down with their arms splayed at odd angles, as if they'd collapsed suddenly. Their flannel shirt and worn jeans blended with the earth, making them almost invisible until you were right upon them. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. No response. I took another step forward, but that feeling in my gut only intensified. I looked at the truck again, trying to spot any telling details. The hood was up, but there was no smoke or steam rising from the engine. Usually, a recently broken down vehicle would show some residual heat signature. This one, however, looked like it had been sitting there for quite some time, undamaged and oddly pristine for such an old model. That's when I noticed a faint movement in the darkness, a shadow shifting beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. My instincts kicked in and I froze. I heard footsteps from the right side, near the thick underbrush at the forest's edge. Before I could react, more footsteps sounded from the left. I didn't need to look to understand I was being surrounded. In that moment, I realized I'd walked into a trap. The figure on the ground suddenly moved, rolling over and sitting up with surprising agility for someone who had appeared unconscious moments before. 4 men emerged from the shadows around me, each holding something in their hands, what looked like hunting knives and a shotgun. It was hard to tell in the dim light, but their intentions were crystal clear. One of them, tall and gaunt with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Wallet, keys, medical supplies, anything valuable you've got," he said in a voice as cold as the mountain air. His accent wasn't local, sounded Eastern European maybe, which struck me as odd this deep in the Colorado wilderness. My heart raced, but I knew better than to resist. Slowly, I reached for my wallet and tossed it to him. They also demanded my Jeep keys and my emergency medical kit, which contained controlled substances worth thousands on the black market. Though it pained me to give up my vehicle and supplies, I understood that nothing was worth risking my life. One of the men got into my Jeep, while another collected my medical bag from the back. The man with the scar noticed my rescue service radio clipped to my belt and yanked it off, smashing it against a nearby rock. "We can't have you calling for help too soon," he said with a chilling laugh. "The nights get cold up here." Before leaving, the man who took my Jeep jotted down my phone number from a business card in the console. He looked at me with a mocking grin, took my phone from my pocket, and hurled it against a boulder, shattering it completely. "We don't want you stranded completely," the scarred man said, tossing me a thin emergency blanket from my own kit. "That would be inhumane." They drove away in both vehicles, my Jeep and the red pickup that had been part of their setup, leaving me alone in the gathering darkness. Miles from the nearest town, without transportation, without communication, and with temperatures expected to drop below freezing within hours. I spent the night huddled beneath that thin emergency blanket, moving constantly to keep warm, and waited until morning when another vehicle finally passed by. A retired park ranger stopped and helped me contact the authorities. When the sheriff arrived, he noted they'd received reports of similar incidents in the area over the past 2 months. This wasn't a random attack, but part of an organized operation targeting travelers on isolated mountain roads, exploiting people's compassion by staging fake accidents. They eventually recovered my Jeep 3 days later, abandoned near the state border, stripped of everything valuable, including the specialized medical equipment that would take my department months to replace. Since that night, whenever I see a stranded vehicle on a lonely road, I find myself second-guessing my instincts. This experience taught me that while helping people is my duty as a paramedic, not everyone has good intentions. Sometimes the best thing we can do is listen to that inner voice warning us when something doesn't feel right. Now when I drive those mountain roads, I carry a satellite phone hidden in my boot, and I always alert dispatch of my location before stopping to help anyone. The wilderness holds many dangers, and not all of them come from nature. I work at a convenience store in a small coastal town in Maine. I'm 28 years old with a master's degree in forensic psychology, but I still haven't found work in my field. My plans to continue into a doctoral program were derailed when my father fell ill, and I needed to move back home to help care for him. A PhD is pretty much the minimum requirement for any decent-paying job in my specialty, so I've been feeling adrift lately. Finding ordinary work proved surprisingly difficult. I applied for several entry-level positions at local businesses and even government offices, but kept hearing the same thing: "You're overqualified." They'd look at my resume, smile politely, and tell me I'd get bored and leave as soon as something better came along. The rejection became demoralizing after a while. When my student loan payments started coming due, and my savings dwindled to almost nothing, I swallowed my pride and asked an old high school friend for help. She managed a 24-hour convenience store called Lighthouse Market on the edge of town, and the only position available was stocking shelves during the overnight shift. I couldn't believe this was where my expensive education had led me. I felt humiliated, like I'd wasted years of my life, and racked up tens of thousands in debt just to end up doing a job anyone could do. The work itself wasn't terrible. For the first few months, the store was pretty quiet between midnight and 5 in the morning. I could listen to my favorite true crime podcasts while organizing shelves and checking expiration dates. The monotony was almost meditative, and I developed a system that made the hours pass quickly. Things changed when tourist season hit. Our sleepy coastal town transformed as vacation rentals filled up, and summer people returned to their second homes. The store's overnight traffic increased dramatically. Insomniacs, partiers needing late-night snacks, fishermen heading out before dawn. My peaceful shifts were constantly interrupted by customers asking where to find items that were clearly labeled on the overhead signs. At first, I didn't mind. Helping people was part of the job, even if I sometimes thought to myself, are they blind or just stupid? But I kept a smile on my face and directed them to the potato chips or whatever else they were looking for. One night in mid-July, around 3 in the morning, a peculiar man entered the store. I noticed him immediately because of his strange appearance. He had these unnaturally wide eyes that seemed to protrude slightly, giving him an owl-like appearance. His body was disproportionately round for his height, and oddly enough, his nose appeared to be covered with what looked like hair, as if he'd plucked hair from his head and glued it to his nose. He wore a heavy wool coat despite the summer heat, and he moved with an unusual shuffling gait. I was kneeling, organizing a shelf of energy drinks, when I felt something touch my hair. I'd tied it in a ponytail that night, and he was stroking the part that fell down my back. I jumped away immediately and demanded to know what he was doing. "Arthritis," he muttered, holding up gnarled hands. "Lost my balance." Sorry, I knew he was lying. His eyes didn't show remorse, they showed calculation. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, putting distance between us. He was silent for what felt like minutes, as if carefully considering his answer. Then he simply said one word, "You." He stepped closer and began sniffing near my shoulder. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the store's air conditioning. I'd interviewed sex offenders for my thesis research, but I'd never felt as uncomfortable as I did in that moment. "If you don't need assistance with shopping, I need to get back to work," I said firmly, trying to sound authoritative despite my racing heart. He didn't leave. Instead, he smiled, a twisted, unnatural expression that revealed yellowed teeth. Then he reached out and grabbed my arm, saying in a raspy voice, "It's okay, precious. I'll take care of you." We belonged together. Inside, I was screaming. This man had crossed every boundary of normal behavior. I shoved him away with more strength than I knew I had, and ran toward the front where my manager, Deirdre, was handling inventory. She was a former roller derby player with arms like steel cables, and wouldn't hesitate to intervene. The man followed me for a few steps, but when he saw Deirdre coming down the aisle, he changed direction and hurried out of the store. I explained what happened, and she promised to ban him and call the police if he returned. "You shouldn't be alone on these shifts anymore," she said. "I'll talk to the owner about hiring security," but nothing changed. The owner was reluctant to spend money on overnight security for what he called an isolated incident. Weeks passed, and I started to relax, thinking the strange man had moved on. I was wrong. Nearly a month after the first encounter, I was stocking the refrigerated section when the power suddenly went out. The emergency lights came on, casting long shadows across the store. Deirdre called from the front, "Just a blown fuse." "I'll check the breaker box." I heard the stockroom door close as she went outside to the utility panel. I was alone in the dimly lit store. That's when I felt someone grab my ponytail and yank with shocking force. The pain shot through my scalp as I was dragged backward across the linoleum floor. I couldn't see who it was until I managed to twist around and saw those same bulging eyes staring down at me with frightening intensity. "Found you," he whispered. "Mine now." He dragged me at least 30 feet toward the back exit before anyone noticed what was happening. It wasn't Deirdre who saw us. She was still outside, but a college student who'd come in for late-night coffee. The student shouted and ran toward us, smartphone in hand, already dialing 911. The man released my hair and fled through the back door, disappearing into the darkness. I was shaking uncontrollably, unable to process what had just happened. Who tries to drag someone out of a store by their hair? What would have happened if that customer hadn't walked in? This time, the police took a report. Security cameras had captured everything, including clear images of the man's face. The power outage they discovered wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately cut the main line to the store. The incident finally convinced the owner to hire overnight security. They also installed better lighting in the parking lot and a panic button system for employees. I started carrying pepper spray and taking self-defense classes. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every sudden noise and couldn't stand having anyone walk behind me. The police never found the man, despite distributing his image throughout the county. Sometimes I think I see him in crowds or glimpse his distinctive silhouette on dark streets, but he hasn't returned to the store. I'm still looking for work in my field of psychology, applying to research positions, and saving for that PhD. After what happened, I've developed a particular interest in studying predatory behavior and helping victims of stalking and assault. Maybe someday I'll be the expert who helps someone like me. Until then, I keep my hair cut short, work only day shifts, and never turn my back on the door. That summer evening, I was working my side gig as a delivery driver. It was already pretty late, around 11:30 or maybe closer to midnight. I'd gotten used to these late shifts since I started, so making deliveries at this hour felt routine for me. The night was unusually still, with hardly any traffic. I cruised along empty streets with my windows cracked, letting in the warm air while my playlist kept me company between orders. When a notification finally pinged, I barely glanced at the details before accepting pickings were slim this late, and I needed to hit my quota for the night. I drove to the pickup location. a small convenience store at the edge of town that was somehow still open. The package was already waiting, a medium-sized box with no markings except the delivery label. As soon as I confirmed the pickup, the app directed me to the delivery, addressed somewhere in the industrial district on the outskirts of town. The drive took about 20 minutes, leading me further from the city center with each turn. Throughout the journey, the streets grew increasingly deserted and poorly lit. I drove on autopilot, mindlessly following the navigation prompts while mentally calculating how much I'd make tonight. As I approached the destination, my navigation directed me onto a street that looked like an old manufacturing zone, but not the kind you typically see in operation. Usually, these places have security lighting, maintained exteriors, and some signs of activity. This area was different. The buildings appeared weathered and abandoned, with overgrown vegetation reclaiming the cracked pavement. The atmosphere felt so oppressive that I instinctively turned down my music. My map guided me into a parking lot beside a single-story commercial building that matched the neglected appearance of everything else around it. I delivered to commercial properties before, so this wasn't unusual in itself. But something about this place made the hairs on my neck stand up. The app indicated I needed to go to the rear of the building, and before I could check more details, I received a message from the customer saying they already spotted me and asking me to bring the package to the blue metal door on the east side of the building. "On my way," I replied, trying to sound professional despite my growing unease. I parked near the building, grabbed the package, and started walking. As I rounded the corner, I realized this really was the back of the building. There was no visible main entrance, just several unmarked doors that looked like emergency exits or service entrances. I located the door mentioned in the message, a blue metal door with no windows, signs, or any markings whatsoever. Just as I approached, another message came through. "Just come inside and leave the package on the table." The doors unlocked. Without thinking twice, something I would later deeply regret, I did as instructed. I opened the door and stepped inside. The interior was a dimly lit hallway with fluorescent lights flickering overhead, some completely burned out. I expected to find a reception desk or counter where I could leave the package, but there was nothing like that. I stood hesitantly for several seconds, debating whether to venture further into the building or wait for someone to appear. I pulled out my phone to message the customer, but before I could type anything, I heard a sound behind me. Turning around, I saw the door I just entered through was now closed. I rushed back and tried the handle, but it was locked. Someone had locked me inside. I felt the blood drain from my face as panic set in. What had I just walked into? I dropped the package and tried the door again with more force, but it wouldn't budge. My only option was to move down the hallway and hope to find another exit before whoever was outside found me. As I started moving, I heard another door opening and closing from somewhere else in the building. My heart hammered against my ribs. I quickened my pace and found another door at the end of the hallway. I quickly opened it and entered another poorly lit corridor with several rooms on both sides. Just as I stepped through, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. Without hesitation, I ducked into the first room I saw and hid behind what looked like old office furniture, covered in dust cloths. A few seconds later, Quick footsteps passed through the corridor and stopped right by the door I had just come through. Someone stood there for what felt like an eternity, then rushed back toward the locked entrance. I seized the moment and sprinted down the corridor in the opposite direction, praying I'd find an exit before they returned. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with a tall figure in dark clothing. I let out an involuntary gasp and stumbled backward, but before I could run, the figure spoke. "Are you lost?" The voice was surprisingly gentle, belonging to an elderly man with silver hair and round glasses. He was holding a flashlight and what looked like maintenance tools. I'm trying to get out," I stammered, still ready to bolt if needed. "You must be the delivery person," he said, nodding. "Follow me. The main entrance is this way." Still suspicious, I kept my distance as he led me through a maze of corridors. "What is this place?" I managed to ask. "Used to be a research facility. I'm the caretaker now," he explained. "We're converting it into art studios, but the renovation's just starting. That's why it looks so unwelcoming." We reached what appeared to be a lobby area, and he pushed open a door that led outside. Fresh air had never felt so good. "Sorry about the confusion," he said. "The app always sends people to the wrong entrance. And these old doors, they lock automatically when they close." His explanation sounded reasonable, but something still felt off. I thanked him hurriedly and started walking toward my car. "Wait," he called after me. "You forgot this." I turned to see him holding out my car keys, which must have fallen from my pocket during my panicked run through the building. "Thanks," I said, taking them cautiously. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I researched the address. It turned out the building was indeed being renovated into art studios after sitting vacant for years. The elderly man's story checked out, but one detail haunted me. When I reviewed the delivery details in my app history, there was no message about coming inside or any blue door, and the customer had marked the package as not delivered. I never took another delivery to that part of town again, and I still wonder about those footsteps chasing me through the dark hallways, and whether the caretaker had really been my savior, or something else entirely. I used to work as a food delivery driver for one of those fancy meal subscription services back in the summer of 2018. Most people think it's a terrible job, but honestly, I didn't mind it that much. The pay was decent, and I got to listen to my podcasts while cruising around the city. Plus, the tips were surprisingly good, especially in the upscale neighborhoods. On this particular Friday evening, I started my shift at 6 o'clock. The company operated late on weekends, until 2 in the morning, to cater to the party crowd and night owls. I was shocked by how many people ordered gourmet meals well past midnight, but I wasn't complaining. More deliveries meant more money in my pocket. The orders kept flowing steadily throughout the night. Around 1:30 in the morning, just when I thought I might be able to clock out early, one final order came through on my app. I was exhausted after making deliveries nonstop, but I figured one more wouldn't kill me. Little did I know how wrong I was. This delivery took me to an area of Colorado I wasn't familiar with. Most of our orders came from the same few neighborhoods, but this one directed me toward the mountains, to an area known for its expensive vacation rentals nestled among dense pine forests. During the day, it was probably breathtaking, but in the dead of night, with a waning moon partially obscured by clouds, it felt like driving into oblivion. I followed the GPS directions until I had to turn onto an unmarked gravel road. It was surprisingly well maintained, with small solar-powered lights embedded along the edges, guiding me deeper into the woods. After about half a mile, the road ended at a small clearing with a wooden sign reading Aspen Shadow Cabins. My app indicated I needed to find cabin number 7. The gravel road split into several narrow footpaths, each barely visible in the dim light. I checked the delivery notes and saw that I couldn't drive any further. I'd have to walk the rest of the way. With a sigh, I grabbed the insulated bag containing 2 meals and a bottle of wine, locked my car, and set off down the path marked Cabins 5-8. The footpath was illuminated by small, solar-powered lights placed every 20 feet or so. They emitted a weak, bluish glow that created more shadows than visibility. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Each pool of light became a sanctuary that I was reluctant to leave, knowing I'd have to navigate through several yards of near darkness before reaching the next one. I could hear the sound of a creek somewhere nearby, the water rushing over rocks, mixing with the rustling of pine needles in the gentle mountain breeze. Occasionally, a night bird would call out, the sound echoing through the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell which direction it came from. I must have walked for about 7 or 8 minutes, though it felt much longer. The path twisted and turned, making me feel increasingly disoriented. Just as I was considering turning back, I spotted cabin number 7. Unlike what I had imagined, it wasn't a charming, well-lit vacation rental. It was a weathered A-frame structure with a large picture window across the front, completely dark inside and out. I approached the cabin cautiously. There wasn't a single light visible from within, not even the glow of a television or phone screen. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the small porch and knocked firmly on the door. The sound seemed to echo inside the empty space, but no one answered. After waiting for what felt like an appropriate amount of time, I called the customer's number. The phone rang and rang before eventually going to voicemail. I hung up without leaving a message, unsure of what to do next. The company policy was clear. We couldn't leave food unattended. But I really didn't want to carry everything back to my car, only to have to return if the customer called. While debating my options, my phone pinged with a text message from the customer's number. Sorry, I stepped out to meet friends at cabin 9. Doors unlocked. Please leave the food on the kitchen counter. Cash tip in envelope by the door. Thanks. I looked at the door handle with apprehension. It felt wrong to enter a stranger's cabin, even with permission. I tried the handle and sure enough, it turned easily. The door swung open with a low creak that seemed to reverberate through the silent forest. Hello, I called out. Food delivery. My voice sounded strange and muffled in the darkness. No response. I reluctantly stepped inside, using my phone's flashlight to navigate. The cabin was a simple open-concept design. A main room with a kitchenette, a small living area, and what appeared to be a bedroom behind a closed door at the back. Everything was tidy but impersonal, like most vacation rentals. I made my way to the counter, placed the food down, and looked around for the promised envelope. There was nothing by the door. I felt a prickle of unease run up my spine. Just as I turned to leave, I heard a floorboard creak from the direction of the bedroom. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out again, my voice noticeably shakier. No answer, but I could have sworn I heard movement. I began backing toward the door, keeping my eyes fixed on the bedroom. Suddenly, the bedroom door swung open. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness. "Thanks for bringing the food inside," a man's voice said, oddly calm. "I've got your tip right here." He stepped forward, and in the beam of my flashlight, I could see his face, expressionless, with eyes that seemed to reflect the light in an unnatural way. He was moving too quickly, too purposefully. In his hand was not an envelope, but something that gleamed metallically in the flashlight beam. I turned and bolted for the door, adrenaline surging through my body. Just as I reached the threshold, I slammed into someone else, a second person who had apparently been waiting outside. The impact knocked me sideways, and I stumbled off the porch, landing hard on my knee in the dirt. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly down the path, not even bothering with the flashlight. I could hear footsteps behind me, twigs snapping and heavy breathing. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, desperate to reach my car. The path seemed twice as long as it had before. I tripped several times on exposed roots and rocks, scraping my hands and tearing my jeans. When I finally broke through the trees into the clearing where my car was parked, I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. I managed to get inside and lock the doors, just as two figures emerged from the tree line. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing at the edge of the clearing, watching as I sped away, tires spitting gravel. As soon as I had cell reception again, I called the police. They took my statement and sent officers to investigate. But by the time they arrived, the men were gone. The cabin had been cleaned meticulously. No fingerprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The reservation for Cabin 7 had been made through a third-party website, using a prepaid credit card and a fake name. The phone number was from a burner phone that had already been deactivated. The delivery order had been placed using a stolen account. It was as if these people had never existed. Sometimes I lie awake at night, thinking about how carefully they planned everything. They knew exactly which delivery service operated latest in that area. They chose a remote location where no one would hear me scream. They deliberately lured me inside with a text message. But what haunts me most is the second man. Had he been hiding outside the whole time I walked that path, silently stalking me through the trees? Or was he waiting at the cabin, anticipating that I'd try to escape? I quit that job the very next day. Now I work in a warehouse where the only things that scare me are the occasional spiders and my manager's bad jokes. But even now, 3 years later, I still can't bring myself to hike in the woods. And I never, under any circumstances, accept deliveries after dark. For almost 15 years, I worked as a food delivery driver to supplement my income. It was mostly routine work, familiar neighborhoods, friendly customers, decent tips. But there's one night from the summer of 2008 that still haunts me. I was working the late shift at Pietro's, an Italian place on the outskirts of Ridgewood, Pennsylvania. Business had been slow that evening, so I was just scrolling through my phone when the order came in at 11:30. Nothing seemed unusual about it. A large pepperoni pizza, garlic knots, and a 2-liter soda. The only thing that stood out was the delivery location. The address was somewhere I'd never been before, about 25 minutes outside town, past the old abandoned mill and toward the mountains. Most deliveries stayed within Ridgewood's limits, but occasionally we'd get orders from the more remote properties. The GPS estimated the drive would take me through some winding back roads, eventually leading to what looked like a private residence deep in Blackwood Forest. "Hey Mike, you ever delivered to Sawmill Road before?" I asked our manager as I packed up the order. He shook his head. "Can't say I have. That's pretty far out. Make sure your phone's charged." By midnight, I was on my way, following the GPS through increasingly unfamiliar territory. The radio reception grew spotty as I drove, until nothing but static filled my car. Outside, a thick fog had settled between the trees, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet ahead. My headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness. After about 20 minutes, I turned onto Sawmill Road, a narrow, unpaved path barely wide enough for my sedan. Tall pines crowded in from both sides, their branches occasionally scraping against my windows. My GPS indicated I should continue for another mile before reaching my destination. The fog grew thicker as I drove deeper into the forest. My headlights reflected off the mist, creating an eerie, glowing tunnel ahead. I slowed down to navigate the increasingly rough terrain, gravel crunching beneath my tires. The summer night was unusually cool, and despite the closed windows, I felt a chill run down my spine. When the GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination," I found myself in the middle of nowhere. There was no house, no driveway, no mailbox, nothing to indicate human habitation. Just dense forest on both sides of the narrow road. I pulled over and double-checked the address. According to both the restaurant's order system and my GPS, this was exactly where I was supposed to be. I tried calling the customer, but my phone showed no service bars. "What the hell?" I muttered, peering through the fog. Maybe the house was set back from the road. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, along with the pizza bag, and stepped out of the car. The silence was immediate and oppressive. No crickets, no distant traffic, no wind rustling the leaves, just complete stillness. I swept my flashlight beam across the tree line, looking for any path or indicator of where to go. That's when I saw it, a small clearing about 15 feet into the woods. Something seemed to reflect my flashlight beam for just a second. I took a few hesitant steps toward it, illuminating what appeared to be a narrow footpath cutting through the underbrush. The path wasn't maintained like a proper walkway. It looked more like it had been worn down by frequent use, with exposed roots and stones creating uneven footing. My instincts were already setting off alarm bells, but I had a job to do. Maybe someone really did live out here, off the grid. I had taken only 3 steps down the path when I noticed something unusual on the ground. At first, I thought it was just a strange rock formation. But as I directed my flashlight beam closer, I realized they were small figurines made of twisted branches and twine, arranged in a semicircle across the path. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard something moving in the woods to my right, not the casual rustling of wildlife, but deliberate, heavy footsteps. They weren't approaching from the path ahead, but from somewhere deeper in the darkness between the trees. Then came the whispers. I couldn't make out words, just the unmistakable cadence of human voices speaking in hushed tones, coming from multiple directions. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. A twig snapped loudly, much closer than the footsteps had been. At the same moment, I caught a glimpse of movement to my left, a dark figure moving between trees about 30 yards away. Then another flash of movement to my right. I didn't wait to see more. I dropped the pizza bag where I stood and sprinted back to my car, fumbling with my keys as the whispers seemed to grow louder. I could feel eyes on me from the darkness as I finally got the door open and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and executed the fastest three-point turn of my life, tires spitting gravel as I accelerated back the way I'd come. In my rearview mirror, just before rounding a bend in the road, I thought I saw several shadowy figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching my retreat. When I finally made it back to the main road, I pulled over and sat there shaking for several minutes, trying to calm myself enough to drive safely back to town. I called the restaurant and told Mike I couldn't complete the delivery because the address didn't exist. I didn't mention the path or the figures. It sounded too crazy, even to me. The next day, I asked my manager to look up the customer's information. Strangely, the phone number didn't work, and the name didn't match anyone in our system. When we tried to charge the credit card again, it was declined. A week later, I was talking to a sheriff's deputy who came in for lunch. I casually mentioned the strange delivery address on Sawmill Road. His expression changed immediately. "There aren't any houses on Sawmill Road," he said, studying my face. That whole area was part of the old logging camp. It's been abandoned since the 70s after those disappearances. Nobody lives out there. I never took deliveries to that area again. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and hit a patch of fog, I still feel that same chill and wonder who or what was waiting for me in those woods, and what might have happened if I'd walked just a little further down that path. It all began on a foggy autumn evening in coastal Maine, back in 1997. I just returned from my shift at the Lighthouse Museum, where I worked as a tour guide. The small cottage I rented sat on a cliff overlooking the restless Atlantic, isolated from the nearest neighbors by a quarter-mile of dense pine forest. As I climbed the creaking wooden steps to my bedroom in the attic to change out of my damp clothes, I heard an odd tapping at my front door. 3 distinct knocks, then silence. I quickly pulled on dry clothes and descended the narrow spiral staircase, peering through the small stained glass window beside the door. The porch was empty, shrouded in mist. When I cautiously opened the door, the cold air rushed in, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Just the distant crashing of waves against the rocks below, and the mournful call of a foghorn in the distance. I closed the door, sliding the antique brass bolt into place, and tried to dismiss it as nothing but a branch blown against the house by the wind, or perhaps a confused traveler who had mistaken my cottage for the bed and breakfast down the road. I spent the remainder of the evening reading by the fireplace, the strange occurrence gradually fading from my thoughts. The next morning, however, I was awakened by another series of knocks, more insistent this time. The old grandfather clock in the hallway showed 5:30, an hour before sunrise, and far earlier than I'd planned to start my day. I remained beneath my quilt, listening intently, but heard nothing more. By the time I dragged myself out of bed at 7, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the porch for any packages or notes, but found only wet leaves plastered to the wooden boards. It was then that an unsettling feeling began to take root. Someone was coming to my door at odd hours, without any apparent purpose. Before heading to work, I methodically checked every window latch and door lock, even propping a chair against the back door for good measure. At the museum, I confided in my coworkers during our lunch break in the small staff room overlooking the harbor. Maria, who had lived in the area her whole life, seemed particularly disturbed. "That doesn't sound right, honey," she said, her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Maybe you should tell Sheriff Caldwell." Thomas, the maintenance man who rarely spoke, surprised us all by chiming in. "Could be kids from the college playing pranks. They come up on weekends sometimes." But something in his tone suggested he didn't believe his own explanation. That evening, as I drove along the winding coastal road toward home, a sense of dread settled over me. Part of me wanted to turn around and get a room at the inn in town. The thought of returning to my isolated cottage filled me with apprehension, especially as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the pine trees. As I rounded the final curve and my cottage came into view, my headlights illuminated a figure standing motionless beside my mailbox. I slammed on the brakes, my tires crunching on the gravel driveway. The figure turned, caught in the harsh glare of my headlights like a startled deer. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of a familiar face, though I couldn't quite place it. Then they darted into the woods, disappearing among the ancient pines. My hands trembled as I reached for my cell phone, but the signal was predictably weak. I managed to get through to the sheriff's office, and within 20 minutes, Sheriff Caldwell's patrol car pulled up beside mine, its blue lights cutting through the darkness. "You say you recognized them?" he asked after I recounted what happened, his flashlight beam sweeping the edge of the woods. "I thought I did for a second," I replied, but I couldn't place who it was. The sheriff did a thorough check of the property, but found nothing except for some footprints in the soft earth near my garden. Without more to go on, there wasn't much he could do except promise to increase patrols in the area. His presence was reassuring, but as I watched his taillights disappear down the road, the comfort went with them. For 2 days, nothing happened. No knocks, no mysterious figures. The only sounds were the eternal rhythm of the waves and the occasional cry of seagulls. I began to think that perhaps the sheriff's increased presence had scared off whoever had been lurking around my home. The following Tuesday, I worked a longer shift than usual, giving a special tour to a group of history professors from Boston. It was nearly 8 in the evening when I finally arrived home. The cottage was dark and quiet as I pulled into the carport attached to the side of the house. I entered through the side door that led directly into the kitchen, dropping my keys on the counter before heading upstairs to change. After slipping into comfortable clothes, I returned to the kitchen to prepare something to eat. As I flipped on the light in the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, sitting at my kitchen table not 10 feet away, was a man. He was watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold, and in that moment, I recognized him. It was James, a man I had dated briefly last summer, while he was in town researching the local maritime history. His once warm eyes now held a vacant stare that chilled me to the core. He wore the same tweed jacket I remembered, but it was wrinkled and stained, as if he'd been wearing it for days. On the table before him lay a small velvet box. "Hello, Alina," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I've been waiting for you." I remained frozen in the hallway, every instinct screaming at me to run. "Please sit," he gestured to the chair across from him. "I just want to talk. I've been trying to find the right moment." I didn't move. Our relationship had lasted just 6 weeks before I ended it. He had seemed perfectly normal then, charming even, if a bit intense. That's why I was so shocked by what I was seeing now. "I've thought a lot about why you left," he continued, opening the small box to reveal a vintage ring with a pale blue stone. "I think I understand now. I wasn't committed enough. I didn't show you how serious I was." As he spoke, his rehearsed speech washing over me, my mind raced through escape options. The front door was behind him. The side door I'd entered through was too close to where he sat. My only viable path seemed to be back up the stairs to my bedroom, where I could lock the door and call for help. Without warning, I spun around and bolted up the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath my feet. I slammed my bedroom door shut, fumbling with the lock as James's footsteps thundered up behind me. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911 as he began pounding on the door, his fists creating dents in the thin wood. "Open the door, Alina," he shouted, his calm facade completely shattered. "Don't you understand? We're meant to be together." The wood around the hinges began to splinter, and panic surged through me. Then, abruptly, the pounding stopped. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice unnervingly composed once more. "I shouldn't have raised my voice. That's not how this is supposed to go." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "James," I called out, surprised by how level my own voice sounded. "I'm willing to talk with you, but I need to feel safe. Why don't we go outside, by the garden? The night air will do us good." There was a pause, and for a moment I feared he'd seen through my deception. Then I heard him sigh. "You're right," he said. "The stars are beautiful tonight. You always did love stargazing." I listened intently as his footsteps retreated down the stairs. Minutes later, I heard the wail of sirens growing closer. Through my bedroom window, I watched as 2 patrol cars sped up the driveway, their searchlights scanning the property. James must have heard them too, because I caught a glimpse of him sprinting toward the path that led down to the beach. The officers pursued him, but in the darkness and unfamiliar terrain, he managed to slip away. His freedom was short-lived, however. The next afternoon, Sheriff Caldwell called to inform me they had apprehended James at a motel in the next town over. What they discovered in his possession was far more disturbing than I could have imagined. His laptop contained hundreds of photographs of me, coming home from work, collecting my mail, gardening in my yard, and even images taken through my living room windows. Disturbingly, all the photos were dated within the last 3 months, long after our relationship had ended. But what made even less sense was the timeline. James and I had parted ways in August of last year, and these photos didn't begin until January, 5 months later. What had triggered this obsession after such a long period of normalcy? The answer came when the authorities searched his motel room. They found journals filled with elaborate fantasies about our life together, interspersed with passages of rage whenever reality intruded on these delusions. The most chilling discovery was a letter I had supposedly written to him, but hadn't, inviting him back into my life. The letter was dated January 3rd, the same day his photo collection began. James was eventually diagnosed with erotomania, a delusional disorder where he believed I was secretly in love with him, despite all evidence to the contrary. The incident forced me to leave my beloved cottage by the sea, a place I had once found so peaceful. I moved to a busy apartment building in Portland with security cameras and a doorman. To this day, I sometimes wake in the night thinking I hear knocking at my door. And though I know James remains in a psychiatric facility hundreds of miles away, I still find myself checking the locks twice before going to bed, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, years later, as I record this story for you to hear, I can't help but glance out my window when the wind picks up, wondering if those shadows moving among the streetlights below are merely trees swaying in the breeze, or something else entirely. During my gap year between high school and college, I worked the closing shift at a roadside diner just off Highway 16. It was one of those classic American diners with neon signs and vinyl booths, the kind you see in movies. I was a waitress, so I spent my entire shift interacting with all kinds of people passing through our small mountain town. After about 8 hours on my feet, the place would quiet down considerably. In the last hour before closing at 11, I'd usually only serve 2 or 3 customers. That's when I'd start on my closing duties, refilling condiments, wiping down tables, and mopping the floors. I never left the diner before midnight, and I was almost always the last person to leave, since the cook would finish cleaning the kitchen earlier and head out. One night in late October, after a particularly slow shift, I walked across the nearly empty parking lot toward my car. A thick fog had settled in, making the amber streetlights create eerie halos in the mist. I noticed that while the parking lot was mostly empty, there was one vehicle, a dark pickup truck, parked right next to mine with its headlights still on. I approached my car cautiously, trying to appear casual while fumbling for my keys. I couldn't help glancing over to see who was inside the truck. When I turned my head, a man in a baseball cap was staring directly at me through his driver's side window. I quickly looked away, but that only made the situation more uncomfortable, knowing he was probably still watching me. I started my car and drove away as fast as I could without looking suspicious. The next day, I mentioned the strange encounter to Marlene, the diner manager, asking if they'd hired someone new for maintenance or deliveries. "No, honey, we haven't hired anyone new in months," she said, refilling her coffee mug. Probably just some trucker taking a break. We get all kinds off the highway. We laughed it off as a coincidence, though something about it still felt off to me. I had the next day off, but when I returned for my closing shift the following evening, everything seemed normal until around 10:30. I hadn't had a customer for about 20 minutes, so I was absent-mindedly organizing the pie display when I noticed a man wandering around the diner. He wasn't carrying a menu and hadn't been seated by our hostess. He just seemed to be drifting between the booths and counter seats without purpose. As I watched him, I caught him glancing in my direction several times. Something about his behavior made me uneasy, so I tried to make myself look busy while keeping an eye on him. A few minutes later, I saw him in my peripheral vision, standing near the hallway that led to the restrooms. When I looked up, I noticed he was positioned with his back to the wall, but his head turned in my direction, watching me. That's when I recognized his face and eyes. It was the same man I'd seen in the truck 2 nights before. A chill ran down my spine, and I looked away, but I could still see him from the corner of my eye. When he finally moved from his spot, I lost sight of him and didn't see him leave the diner. I was the only server on duty at that hour, so if he wanted to order anything, he would have had to come to my section. By 11, I was convinced he must have left. My last customer paid their bill, and I began my closing routine, counting my tips, wiping down the counter, and restocking the napkin dispensers. I asked Marlene if she needed help with anything else, but she said I could go. "You look tired, sweetheart. Go on home and get some rest." The parking lot was nearly empty as usual, and I was relieved to see no vehicles parked near my car. The fog was even thicker than the night before, limiting visibility to about 20 feet in any direction. I headed toward my car, keys already in hand, when suddenly I was blinded by bright headlights that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Someone had switched on their high beams, aimed directly at me from the far end of the lot. I quickened my pace, hearing the engine growl as the vehicle moved toward me. I reached my car and scrambled inside just as the vehicle, which I could now see, was the same dark pickup truck pulled up and blocked me in. My heart pounded against my ribs as I locked the doors and started the engine. The man jumped out of his truck and ran to my door. He yanked hard on the handle, trying to get in, then began checking the back doors. In the rearview mirror, I could see his face contorted with rage, his mouth moving as he shouted something I couldn't hear over my own panicked breathing. I threw my car into reverse, nearly hitting him as I backed up over the curb and onto the grass behind me. He quickly jumped back into his truck, but instead of pursuing me, he sped away in the opposite direction, disappearing into the fog. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to pull over a mile down the road. I immediately called the police on my cell phone, convinced it was the same man I'd seen watching me in the diner. When the officers arrived, they took my statement and reviewed the security footage from the diner's exterior cameras. But the combination of darkness and fog made it impossible to identify his face or license plate clearly. The case was quickly marked as unresolved due to insufficient evidence. I never saw the man again after that incident, but I quit my job at the diner the following week. I couldn't shake the waves of fear that washed over me every time I had to walk to my car after dark. I later learned from Marlene that a woman at another diner, 30 miles up the highway, had reported a similar experience. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and see a dark pickup truck in my rearview mirror, I still feel that same paralyzing fear, wondering if it's him, and wondering who else he might be watching. I'm a 23-year-old grad student at Westlake University, nestled in the mountains of Colorado. The campus is beautiful, all stone buildings and towering pines. But the isolation can be suffocating, especially for someone like me who struggles with social interactions. I've always been the quiet type. Words don't flow easily for me in unfamiliar social settings, and the constant pressure to make small talk exhausts me. When winter semester began, and the snow started piling up outside my dorm window, I decided to try something different. I downloaded Ember, this new dating app everyone was talking about. I knew dating apps weren't exactly ideal for meaningful connections, but striking up a conversation through a screen felt infinitely more manageable than approaching someone at one of the campus coffee shops. The first couple of weeks went exactly as I expected. I matched with a few women, exchanged some messages, but nothing clicked. Then I matched with Zoe. Her profile said she was studying marine biology, which seemed odd for a landlocked mountain university. But she explained in her bio that she had transferred from San Diego last semester. We had similar tastes in obscure indie movies, and both loved winter hiking, a rarity even among Colorado students. We connected immediately. After messaging back and forth for nearly 2 weeks, I suggested meeting up at Pines and Brews, this rustic microbrewery just off the edge of campus. It was always busy enough to feel safe for a first meeting, but quiet enough that you could actually have a conversation. I was nervous but excited. Zoe seemed perfect. That Friday evening, I arrived 15 minutes early, secured a corner table with a view of the entrance, and ordered a flight of their seasonal brews. I messaged Zoe to let her know I was there and where to find me. 30 minutes passed with no sign of her. I sent another message. Nothing. After 45 minutes, my excitement had curdled into embarrassment. The bartender kept glancing at me with poorly disguised pity. Just as I was about to give up, my phone pinged. Something came up. Need to reschedule. So sorry, cold, but at least she responded. I paid my tab and stepped out into the biting February air. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the walk back to campus seemed much longer than the walk there. As I trudged through the fresh powder, headlights illuminated the road behind me. A black SUV slowed alongside where I walked. The passenger window rolled down, and a man's voice called out, "Heading back to Westlake. It's freezing out there. Need a ride?" I barely glanced at him. "No thanks, I'm good," I replied, picking up my pace slightly. Something about his question bothered me. How did he know I was heading to Westlake specifically? The campus was nearby, sure, but there were several small businesses and residential areas in this direction too. The SUV lingered for a moment longer before accelerating away. I watched its taillights disappear around a bend, then continued my walk, pulling my coat tighter against the cold. By the time I reached my dorm, my toes were numb, and I'd already decided to take a break from dating apps altogether. 3 days later, I was walking to my part-time job at the university library. It was early afternoon, the campus paths mostly empty, as most students were either in class or still sleeping. I took my usual shortcut through the wooded area that separated the science buildings from the library. The fresh snow muffled my footsteps, creating that peculiar winter silence that seems to swallow all sound. That's when I heard the crunch of tires on the service road that ran parallel to my path. Through the trees, I spotted a black SUV moving slowly, too slowly. Something clicked in my brain, and I immediately recognized it as the same vehicle from Friday night. My pulse quickened. I veered off the path, moving deeper into the trees, hoping the driver hadn't spotted me. The SUV stopped. I heard a car door open and close. I started running through the snow, no longer concerned about making noise. The trees provided some cover, but the snow betrayed my path with every footprint. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone moving quickly through the underbrush. I risked a glance back and saw him, a figure in a dark jacket gaining ground. My lungs burned from the cold air as I sprinted toward the library, which now seemed impossibly far away. There was no one else around. The isolated campus that had once seemed so picturesque now felt like a trap. I fumbled for my phone, but realized with horror that I had left it charging in my dorm room. Just as I was about to break from the tree line, I heard him closing in. In desperation, I ducked behind a large pine and held my breath. The footsteps slowed, then stopped completely. I could hear his labored breathing as he searched for me. "Come on out," he called, his voice unsettlingly calm. "I just want to talk. Zoe sent me to find you." That confirmed my suspicions. There was a connection to my dating app match. I remained frozen, not daring to move a muscle. After what felt like an eternity, I heard him retreating, snow crunching under his boots. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, then carefully peered around the tree. The path appeared empty. Taking my chance, I sprinted the remaining distance to the library. I burst through the doors, startling my supervisor, who was at the front desk. "Someone's following me," I gasped, the words tumbling out between desperate breaths. She immediately locked the doors and called campus security. While we waited, I looked out the window and felt my blood run cold. The black SUV was parked directly across from the library entrance. When campus security arrived, they found the SUV still there, but empty. They took my statement and escorted me back to my dorm, promising to increase patrols in the area. I spent the rest of the day checking my locks and jumping at every sound in the hallway. The next morning, I received a message from Zoe. "Sorry about yesterday. Let's try again tonight. Same place at 8. I stared at my phone, a chill running down my spine. I hadn't told her anything about being followed, and I certainly hadn't mentioned that someone had used her name. Instead of responding, I took my phone and the messages to the campus police office. The officer looked concerned as I recounted everything. "We've had 3 similar reports this semester," she said grimly, "all involving dating app matches that never showed up. They set up a sting operation. That evening, an undercover officer waited at Pines and Brews, while I stayed safely in the police station. Sure enough, the black SUV appeared, circling the parking lot several times before parking. When they arrested the driver, they found zip ties, duct tape, and a hunting knife in his vehicle. His phone contained multiple dating app profiles, including Zoe's, all fake, all carefully crafted to appeal to specific students he'd been targeting. He'd been using the app to gather information, then stalking his potential victims to learn their routines. Most disturbing of all was his journal, which detailed his failed attempts with other students and his growing obsession with finding someone quiet and isolated who wouldn't be immediately missed. Someone like me. The dating app company later confirmed that he had been creating profiles using information scraped from social media accounts of real students from other universities, making his profiles seem legitimate and relatable to his targets. I still have nightmares about what might have happened if I hadn't hidden behind that tree, or if I had responded to that final message. The woods behind the science building no longer seem beautiful to me, just full of places someone could hide. I'm more careful now. We all are on campus, but sometimes when I'm walking alone and hear a car slow down nearby, I can't help but run. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.